Here in Europe, the blowback against migrants and refugees is real. If it's not another stinging loss for Angela Merkel in regional elections, it's an upcoming referendum in Hungary to refuse asylum seeker quotas, or French regions, which refuse to take in any of the 9,000 refugees in Calais. Now, while the French fret over 9,000, the UN is looking at 65 million displaced around the planet. A new survey says a mere 14% of them have found refuge in the developed world. Already, a UN summit on burden sharing, though, has been watered down. Quotas for rich countries have been scrapped, and hopes are minimal for a second summit on Tuesday to be hosted by Barack Obama. There is a last chance saloon feel to this UN week in New York, with populists tapping into genuine fears that rolling out the welcome mat can only serve as an advertisement for more to try their luck. But can you really shut the door on globalization and shut out the noise of suffering, even when it's halfway around the world? What are the options? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at a world of refugees with nowhere to run. With us from New York, Gillian Melchior, political editor of the internet current affairs website Heat Street. Thank you for joining us. Jonathan Chaloff of the International Migration Division of the Paris-based Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Shoshana Fine, research associate at the French political science institute Sciences Po. Your work most notably taking a look on the country that takes in the most refugees these days, Turkey. Thank you for joining us. And joining us from Brussels, Michel Mondricamen. He is the president of the People's Party of Belgium. Thank you for joining our discussion.
Thank you for inviting me.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Ahead of that summit in New York, London awoke to a graveyard of refugee life jackets on the lawn outside the Houses of Parliament. This protest that was done 2 days after thousands marched for refugee rights in the UK capital. Polls suggest, though, that these activists are in the minority. Well, with the recent Brexit vote widely seen as a plebiscite on immigration, and over in Germany, meanwhile, 1 year after Angela Merkel opened the door to asylum seekers, more gains by the anti-immigrant AfD party. It finished fifth in Berlin state regional elections, but with more than 14% of the vote, it's the strongest show by the far right in the German capital since the Nazis. As for the German chancellor, well, she accepts responsibility for the relegation of her party into fourth place, but vows she'll stay the course when it comes to values.
If people think that we should simply not welcome foreigners, in particular people of Muslim faith, then our constitution and the legal obligations of our country will stand in their way. The ethical foundations of the Christian Democrats of Germany will stand in their way, and my personal beliefs will stand in their way too.
Shoshana Fine, is she more and more alone at this point with statements like that one?
Yes, I think unfortunately she is more alone, but I think that it's important that she's taking this leadership role and trying to push for taking on a different paradigm, for taking a different approach to dealing with this migration crisis, and actually trying to see it as something that can contribute to our societies rather than necessarily something to be seen as a burden or as a security threat.
Michel Mondricamen, do you agree with the German chancellor when she says we're not going to target people because of their religion?
First of all, I think that the majority of people all over Europe clearly oppose the open border policy of Mrs. Merkel, of more generally of the Western leaders. They oppose it because they see the trend of refugee as, first of all, not refugee, but economic migrants, most of them unqualified. And while there's already over 40 million unemployed people in Europe. And on top of that, most of these people are indeed coming from a Muslim background with some backwards views vis-à-vis our culture, vis-à-vis the equality right of the woman, for example. And we can see the violence that have erupted, notably in Germany, since the influx of migrants last year, remember Cologne and so on, clearly a lot of these people are not adapted to our societies. And in the People's Party and the IDD, our political Eurosceptics group, we believe that real refugees have to be helped, but in their country or at the border of their country, at the borders with Syria, for sure, need to be helped and protected, but they shouldn't be allowed to come to Europe.
All right, let me bring in Jonathan Chaloff on several of those points. First of all, are the people coming to Europe, are they economic migrants or are they genuine asylum seekers?
Well, I think first of all, every migrant has their own story, and so you can't really lump them into just two groups. No, that the second point is that Europe has taken an obligation to review the individual applications for asylum. It's been that if you look at the asylum inflows in the last 2 years, a large number of these asylum applications have been rejected and people have been sent home. So not everyone who comes goes. I don't think that you can say that it's an open border policy. There are borders and there are people who are being brought through different legal mechanisms, and there are also people who are coming and applying for asylum and going through a procedure. That said, obviously the system that's in place right now is not capable of handling an asylum inflow of this magnitude. And so new mechanisms need to be found to be able to deal with the volume.
And on this comment that Muslims who come have backward views on culture and women's rights?
Well, everything we know about the people who are coming is that the majority are very interested in integrating, that the majority come to establish a new life and to contribute and to become part of the society to which they've moved.
Gillian Melchior, something we'll talk about a little bit later on the campaign trail, Donald Trump talking about a cancer within in the U.S. U.S. Muslims are very worried about this point, about the how they're being tarred with the same paintbrushes as the person who carried out that attack in the New York area. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's heartbreaking to generalize a population like that. His comments are clearly pretty extreme. But I think part of the reason why they've resonated in the United States is a concern that while there is a refugee crisis, that we're not being realistic. I think it's been painted as a false choice between you're either compassionate toward refugees and therefore all in, or you want none of them. I'd like to see a middle ground on this. And I think Canada has actually done a really good job of coming forward with a program where you sponsor refugees. And that's a non-governmental approach largely. It's gotten people involved in reaching out, relating directly to refugees. And I think that community involvement really creates a situation where you can have assimilation, where you can have community checks. Certainly no one wants radicalization through the refugee population, but this is, the largest refugee population since World War II. It is an international crisis. And I think the suggestion that we wouldn't help these people is frankly horrifying.
All right, and this 65 million people, the subject of a first ever UN refugee summit. It opened a short while ago in New York City. Mariam Saab has the story. All right, we'll try to go to that report a little bit later. Interesting thing about this this summit that's opened is that it had a document, and I'll put it to you, Jonathan Chaloff, and it was purged of a pledge to resettle 10% of the world's refugees in the developed world. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that there's a challenge in convincing countries to to share responsibility, and so. It was very difficult to expect countries to sign up to a specific numerical pledge of this kind. But I think what you see is that there's a search for a way to share responsibility, and there are different means to do that. So if we can, what the OECD has recommended in this case is, first of all, obviously to step up resettlement. So that can be increased quotas, but also more funds for those countries which do take resettled migrants. The second is to improve reception in the country where the first country of refuge. And the third actually is to find alternative channels, alternative pathways. That is, try to find more innovative mechanisms. We heard actually about this Canadian sponsorship one. That's one possible channel, but there are many others. There are qualified refugees, and they are never on the top of the list for resettlement. These are people who could come through labor migration channels, who could come to study in universities. They're very unlikely to be the ones selected by UNHCR for resettlement. And so these are the people who give up hope and try to smuggle themselves.
All right, let's look at the numbers of refugees around the world. It spiked to 65 million, with the civil war in Syria accounting for a good portion of that rise. This is the numbers since the late 1980s. You can see there, and the number is going up. 86% of them never get anywhere near the developed world. Here are the statistics, and again, we see Turkey is the country that takes in the most refugees. Kind of impressive when you look at that graph is countries like Lebanon, Jordan, small countries, and you see just what kind of a burden it is for them when you see the refugees coming across. What's been your experience when you look, Shoshana Fine? We were talking about how each case is different, but the refugees that are in Turkey, what kind of citizens did you find there?
I think what kind of citizens did I find out? When I first started doing research in Turkey back in 2011, I found very much a mixture of populations, Afghan, Iranian, Iraqi, and obviously since the outbreak of the Syrian crisis, we see more and more Syrians, we see men, women, children, families, and what we can really see, what these figures really reveal, is that it's very difficult to speak about a European refugee crisis when we see what's going on in neighbouring countries like Turkey, which, as you said, is now hosting more refugees than any other country in the world, or Lebanon, where almost a third of its population are now refugees. In terms of the kinds of profiles, as I said, very much a diversified kind of profile. And then we should also look at the kinds of refugees that are being resettled from Turkey, because what we can really see, this is a very small percentage of the refugees from Turkey who are being resettled to the United States, to Australia, to Canada, and a small number to Europe.
So this idea, part of the deal that was fleshed out between the EU and President Erdogan in Turkey was that we would try eventually to have these so-called hot spots where we could vet them before dispatching them elsewhere and not have them come in an unruly fashion over to Europe. How's that going?
I mean, the deal is very problematic on many grounds. The deal is basically not working. The deal is problematic morally speaking, ethically speaking, legally. Very few refugees have been resettled from Europe to Turkey. I think we're talking about 1,000 when the deal indicated there should be about 75,000, and a certain number of refugees and migrants have been sent back to Turkey. Now, this is legally quite dubious because although Turkey is signatory to the Geneva Convention, it's supplied a geographical limitation and does not respect the rights of refugees. We've seen cases of torture in Turkey. We've seen cases in which border guards have shot at refugees, have injured and killed refugees and migrants. This is not a country which is respecting refugee rights. Refugees are experiencing difficulties acquiring housing, acquiring work permits, education, these real fundamental rights that refugees should be having some kind of access.
Michel Mondrian, what's your reaction?
Again, refugees are a minority, and the problem, as you say, is that the majority do not receive the status of refugee, but they just disappear, and they never leave Europe, they never leave Belgium, they never leave Germany, they never leave the other countries, and these people become without papers and enter into the black market for working with low wages, prostitution, criminality, and things like this. So I think it's really not the option to follow. And again, a very large majority of the people are opposed to their coming in Europe. Again, also I think a large majority of people want to help, but a different kind of help. Clearly, they should stay in neighboring countries, in Africa or in the Middle East, where they could be helped. The problem is that the moment that you have a kind of relatively...
Michel, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're going to have to cut in because we have breaking news out of New York City at the police department after the apprehension of that suspect in those New York City area bombings over the weekend. Let's cross over there.